everybody. Welcome to my talk. It's called I Was Lost in Space. I'm Alex Williams. I'm not Mattia. Some of you may not have gotten the update, but I was asked to give a talk in his stead. Unfortunately, KLM decided he needs to stay in Italy. So I'm going to introduce myself real quick. I am a game designer with an independent game development background. Currently, I work at Guerrilla Games here in Amsterdam as a designer. But really, this talk is more about kind of who I was, because I am revisiting a project I did in college a couple years back. This was around like 2014, 2015. Back before I had made any significant moves in my career. I hadn't had any internships, I hadn't won any like competitions, I hadn't really had any industry experience, and I was kind of still unsure as to where I wanted to go creatively as a developer. And I kind of took that opportunity to try a bunch of really dumb things all at once. And the project I ended up taking on was I wanted to build a fully realized game environment focused on delivering a character piece through environmental storytelling, and then tackle that from every angle. So from design, from art, implementing it in Unreal Engine 4, I think in this case, to sort of like push my boundaries and do some things that still made me uncomfortable as well. So real quick, what do we mean when we talk about environmental storytelling? The name is pretty self-explanatory. The way I like to think of it is it's narrative through inference and exploration in an environment. So it's narrative design at its core. I'm sorry I'm doing this talk at what is basically a tech conference, but I hope you'll forgive me. But it's also very multidisciplinary because it is the sum of all of its parts. If the art isn't where it needs to be, if the design isn't where it needs to be, it's to the detriment of the message you're trying to get across. So it's very holistic, which appeals to the indie developer in me, basically. And it's still kind of a growing point of focus as well. There's a lot more that we can do. The examples I'm showing are relatively classic still. It's a lot of just straight up exploring and taking in what you're seeing as a player. I think there's a lot of companies now that are pushing the boundaries with that a little bit more interactively, but we're just going to go through what I built. So first, we're going to go through some terms and theory. I want to talk really briefly about cinema and video games. I feel like historically, games have often borrowed conventions from cinematography in order to sell their stories. It's kind of a growing pain of a very young medium that we borrow things from other mediums in order to kind of like legitimize the way that we convey narrative and stories. So classically speaking, most of the game stories we're used to seeing have been still in terms of creating shots and doing cutscenes and basically putting what equates to a movie scene into bits of interactivity interspliced. So this creates a lot of tension. It kind of contradicts what makes games and interactivity strong in the first place. If you're just going to be shown what you're supposed to be getting out of it narratively, then what's the point of putting it in that medium over just making it a movie, right? These two terms are going to come back every now and then. Push and pull. When I say push and pull, I mean the way that people take information from the game they're playing, like narrative information, for instance. So being pushed is being given a scene. Pulling is being made to want to participate in discovery and interpreting what you're seeing. And a lot of this is geared towards creating these pull narratives. So my core approach in this project is kind of breaking down what makes a place in a game. And there's sort of three areas I came up with. It's identifying the causality of an environment, talking about how you're framing the environment for the player, and then talking about the kinds of affordances that you're affording to the objects that you're populating the environment with. And I'll go into detail on these three after we're done here. I'm not really going to go into the art and sound so much, the production side of that. I'd be happy to talk about it later if anyone wants to come up to me, but I kind of had to focus on the high-level kind of design goals and the process I went through for that. So first about causality. When we say causality, what we mean is we mean the broad strokes of what set events in motion. If you look at any kind of fictional setting or a real-world setting, there's a chain of cause and effect that made things the way they were. Really, it's more like a web, and I'll show you in an example. This is a chart from BioShock, which was a game released in 2007. Here it's labeled as backstory plus event. This is a web of causality. In the case of BioShock, which is about a fallen utopia under the sea built by a objectivist like mega billionaire, we have these series of events. So Andrew Ryan founds Rapture on philosophy of objectivism. There's an abundance of goods, which leads to decadence, which leads to a sense of entitlement, which leads to societal decay, and various other elements of the setting. Within a high-level overview of causality, there's often little micro-causalities that fit within that web. So I have here a little side branch as an example. Let's say, as a player, you enter a room, and you see a scene in front of you where somebody has tried to rob an ATM or a vending machine, and in the process, they've gotten mad, rattled it, and it's fallen over and crushed them. This happened before you ever entered the space, but this causality still fits within the larger scheme of causality for the setting. So, going on to framing, it's kind of the most old school of the terms I'm going to be using. It's really a direct link back to the conventions of movie. But really what it's about is it's creating a mise en scène. It's arranging objects and things in an environment in a way that delivers a message in a calculated manner. And there's a gradation of like interpretability, how direct or ambiguous you want to be with the message that is in that set piece. But it's about framing these shots in an environment. The big challenge here is guiding the player's frame, as it were. When a person is navigating a game space, you're not in charge of their camera, they're in charge of their camera. So the vending machine would be, the vending machine example from the previous slide would be one of these framing moments, right? We've arranged things in a certain way, and we want to draw the player's attention to it so that they can infer what we want them to get from it. This is the biggest problem with interactivity when you approach world building from this angle, and there's lots of solutions that designers have come up with over the years to make this work, like from using colored lights or blood trails on the floor or sounds or whatever. These are all ways that we guide the player's frame as they're navigating an environment. So, oh, that's interesting. That's not working. Okay, well, I'll skip that slide. So, to summarize, framing makes causality of an environment traceable and interpretable through associative power. And when I say interpretation, I mean evaluation of a situation based on the player's personal views. What makes this powerful is that it makes the process of inferring narrative active. It makes it feel like you're learning about what happened around you. And as a result, you become invested in the interpretation. This is the pull narrative that I was talking about. So moving on to affordances. Affordances are the qualities of an object. They are communicating and foreshadowing the qualities of an object, and they might be used to telegraph attention as well, which is like the blood trail example. So blood trails, bumps in the nights. But a classic example of an affordance that gives a subconscious expectation to somebody is like a handle on a teacup. A handle on an object implies that it's meant to be held. This is what an affordance does. And affordances can also be done badly. Here's an example from one of the, I think it's Fallout 3, where somewhere in a subway you find a scene where somebody has tried to jump a motorcycle off of a ramp and crashed in the process. This doesn't align with the affordance of basically every other vehicle you encounter in the game, because we cannot use vehicles as a player. There's one faction that has a helicopter that's specifically associated with them, but other than that, all the vehicles we encounter are derelict and unusable. So here the player is reminded of kind of the artificiality of the scene because it is outside of what they're capable of doing in the game. So, how do we describe a character knowing these things? I've spent time kind of going through various lines of thinking. I didn't have time to include my references in the presentation, but if you want my reading material, I'd be happy to hand it over. The way that we're going about this is we're thinking of characters in terms of 3D bone structure. So this is a flexible source of relationships that we think about when we talk about describing a character. And it's generally subdivided into physiological qualities, sociological qualities, and psychological qualities for a given character. And on top of that, we have some design tools that we can use to influence the way that a character is experienced. In classic game examples, these would be something like predefined functions, which basically falls within the realm of cutscenes or scripted events, things that as a designer we have complete control over. You have goals. You can communicate quite a lot about a character through the kinds of goals, even in a very sort of meta sense that a game tells you should follow. So a classic example is Thief had a first Thief game. I think the higher up the difficulty chain you went, the less you were allowed to resort to violence. So actually, by communicating a goal, you're saying something about what the designer thinks like the ultimate form of this character is, right? Is they're straying away from violence to be a better thief. And then finally, there's possible and impossible actions, which is basically either mechanically or narratively defining what a person can and can't do. So this is sort of what that 3D structure looks like. It's all these kinds of qualities in various categories. So putting a character into an environment, we're mashing all of this up, and what are we getting? What we want to do is we want to externalize this bone structure into the environment. This is going to play directly into the causality of that environment. There's kind of like two layers to this. There's the causality of the setting itself, and if you're looking at a specific space that a character occupies, like a room, which is basically what I ended up doing, is a person's room, and we'll get into that, you're looking at how these two different sort of causalities combine to make something, right? If you have a bed that's there because you need a bed, and people generally have beds in the world, so that's the world causality right there, but then what you do with that bed is sort of like you applying your own bone structure on top of that. So an example of this might be like a workstation. Let's say you have a setting where someone works at a high-tech factory, they have a workstation, maybe the factory allows them to choose what kind of workstation they want. It can't be like top of the line, but it wouldn't be crap either. And then, I mean, does it come with color options? Did this character pick a color for what reason? Are they a rebel, or are they used to, you know, getting their way or whatever? There's a lot of like little thoughts that go into arranging the way that an environment is affected by a character, and back and forth. So the final thing is that all objects in your scene should be justified by this causality and also serve the character you're trying to communicate. So we're going to redefine some terms now. Predefined functions in terms of environment. We're setting an objective as a designer. We've looked at our bone structure, we've identified a character quality, we're saying, for this bit of the room, I'm going to make a lectern with a laptop and some bottles and things, and I'm going to try to communicate X, Y, and Z character quality-wise by setting up this scene, and maybe leave another few qualities up to interpretation. Maybe I literally want it to have the speaker's name on it so that everyone knows this is that guy's laptop. Maybe someone, you know, spilled a cup of coffee over it. You're framing these shots for people to interpret in 3D space. The coffee actually brings me to a nice example. When thinking about these kinds of setups, there's also like another layer, what I call a micro-narrative, which is basically tiny details that can be used to string players from point to point. So you might approach a desk like this as a player, and you might see, okay, it's obviously this was used for something, this is someone's personal affects, but also somebody just spilled coffee all over the floor. Why did this happen? And maybe 2 rooms down, you find another object, but through the little details in it, you can trace the cause and effect of whatever made the coffee happen to this next scene, even if the purpose of the frames are sort of like separate for separate character qualities. So this is kind of like how I apply goals and actions in environment as well, is we're shifting it from an implicit statement to support and justification. We're using a chain of events to communicate a character's goals, and then we're communicating actions over time in the same way. So finally, affordances in an environment, it plays a role in literally all language, visual, audio, text, it doesn't matter. It's the rules of language. So back to the workstation example, an interesting affordance there might be, what is the desk made out of? Is it shiny and metal? Is it rusty, and has it been like improvised and changed over time? These little details can communicate quite a lot about a setting and how a character reacts to it. Of course, cautionarily, and this is something I ran into during this project, you kind of want to mind the detail level. It's better to do less than more, focus on what you really want to do if it's not at the cost of sort of the believability of the setting, because at some point it just becomes noise. But it's very important to think about affordances. I'm actually going to borrow a quote from the Red Letter Media people. You might not have noticed, but your brain did. This really sells settings. So, moving into what I actually did, I decided what I'm going to do is I'm going to write like a hard sci-fi setting. I'm going to come up with a character that inhabits this world, and I'm going to put them on like a spaceship in deep space and build like an inhabited environment that this character would live in. So a note about science fiction, hard sci-fi can really detract you from focus. I like it because I'm into technicalities and details, and I think that it can bring really interesting character solutions because you have real-life limitations in the settings. Like something is just would be done a certain way, and it's sort of like how constraints breed a lot of creativity. It's a cool way to constrain yourself. But if the detail of the hard sci-fi is not immediately pertinent to what you're trying to do, it's easy to get carried away with things that don't matter. In my case, I had a general idea of what this ship might be shaped like and how it would work, but as far as the player is concerned, they're just in a room. If they have a suggestion of a ship that seems like it's anchored in reality, that's all they need. It's like you don't need to spend a bunch of time figuring these details out if actually it might be more pleasing to the player for them to just be interpretive about what the context is that they're in. So I'm just going to do a primer for the setting I ended up doing. The setting is the DSC Isaac, which is the first sort of colonization attempt that man ever does. Very optimistically, my thinking was that somewhere along the mid-21st century, we'd have a post-fusion society. So we'd have a society that has harnessed fusion energy to the point that we've escaped out from under the fossil fuel crisis. So we've developed a renewed interest in not just space travel, but also space manufacturing. There's a lot that you can do in zero gravity, resource and manufacturing-wise, that can't be done terrestrially, like creating super foamed materials that are actually way stronger and more durable, but are like light as a feather, for instance, or interesting crystal structures and glass, stuff like that. So we have a bit of a new technological golden age, which eventually leads to this colonization effort. Let's send a group of the best and brightest, a bunch of scientists that can do work underway that'll be relevant when they get there. Let's send them to Tau Ceti F, which is a Goldilocks zone planet that's about 11.8 light years away. And because of the way that travel in space works, this journey would take them about 14 years on Earth time and about 5 years in ship time. As you approach the speed of light in space, time begins to dilate from one point compared to another, which actually means that it's very likely that by the time colonists would arrive here, the next fleet following them up probably would have made it to the planet already because technology will have advanced back at Earth in the meantime. But the way I see this working is that this technological revolution fixes a lot of the problems that we currently face with long-term space flight. Most importantly, developing an engine that can use fusion power to deliver enough thrust constantly to actually accelerate a ship to about near light within the span of like 6 months of travel, and then maintain that speed and then eventually slow down again at the last leg of the journey. So here's the narrative primer of what's going on. When we see the room in the ship, we're in a situation where travel went pretty fine at first. At some point, though, a couple years in, over the last leg of the journey, some kind of pulse, an energy blast, something hits this ship in deep space, right? And in the meantime, they've remained lost in transit over about 22 ship years. At this point, no one has any clue what time it is on Earth. There haven't been any communications, and it's really starting to put a strain on the resources that this crew has. The ship was built for near indefinite survivability, but it was still sort of prototypical, so by the time you're 30 years into a flight like this, things start to break down, all kinds of new problems start to arise, and everyone's getting kind of old at this point. If you crew a ship with a bunch of people in their 30s, 20s, 40s, by the time you get to this point, everyone's like nearing old age, and it's becoming harder and harder to actually do the kinds of jobs that you need to do to keep a ship like this running. One more important detail. DSC Isaac also saw the first ever childbirth in space. Soren was born only weeks before the pulse struck, and this is the character that we'll be focusing on building an environment for. Somebody that grew up in an environment that was never meant to accommodate them. So when it comes to practical execution, we're going to be filling the space with this bone structure, and then we're going to look at actually designing the space around them. And this is where I really hit a snag as a student. I'd never thought I would be spending time looking at production design or trying to solve all kinds of technical solutions and considerations, defining what the ship is, you know, going into depth on the room and ship and room causalities. This is eventually what the chart ended up looking like for the character, and I'll just kind of like go through them in detail. So, who do we have? Soren skeleton, physiology. He's male, he's 22 years old, pale skin due to life under artificial light. He's got auburn hair, dark brown eye color, and an upright, rigid posture. He's got a neat, tidy appearance, but slightly makeshift or improvised clothing and accessories as a result of living outside of mission parameters. A right ring finger was amputated in an accident involving an artificial gravity malfunction. Slight muscular build, but physically fit as a result of lifelong spaceflight exercise regimens to combat muscle loss and bone density. Raised in a classless society, but driven by authority due to the presence of highly trained and specialized crew members. He grew up in an environment that encourages making oneself useful, respecting superiors, and intellectual development. He's privately schooled in math, science, history by the mission's education software professional and encouraged to pursue his own interests and explore the ship's knowledge base. Soren's family is Danish-American from his father's side and British from his mother's side. Soren grew up in a community consisting entirely of adults and never had any peers. Soren can be found browsing a digital library for subjects that interest him and occasionally tinkers with materials and equipment. So, Soren's parents are mission-critical personnel. They run the Isaacs medical labs, and he also has a pretty stable relationship with them, has relatively had little need to rebel during his teenage years, but he's also aware that he's being groomed to a degree by his parents and the other crew members. So psychology-wise, he holds logic, intelligence, and openness in high regard. He was raised multiculturally in an academic environment, and he's basically surrounded by very strongly opinionated adults. So he has to be diplomatic, and he feels like his opinions aren't always heard. Soren's determined to prove his value and unconditionally puts the mission before anything else. He's absolutely devoted to ensuring that the sacrifices of those around him are not in vain, and most importantly, realizes it's the only way out of his entrapment. He's very curious by nature, and although not particularly daring, he spends a lot of time thinking about exploration and treading new ground. He views his time on the Isaac as leading up to something. This idea motivates him to keep thinking forward and away from doubt. Conversely, he does often feel completely trapped, wondering what it would be like to leave his life behind completely. Soren is routinely evaluated by the ship's psychologist. So yes, there's a lot of me in there. Funny thing, when people write their first characters, usually they write basically themselves in an alternate universe. I'm very original in that respect. I think, locking yourself up in your room to crunch through a project like this that was way over scope from the beginning, it's like a pretty high significance or it's a pretty high odds that you end up basically writing yourself into an alternate reality. I also named him after a figure from existentialist philosophy because that's what you do, I guess. It's pretty funny in hindsight. With that being said, Artsplosion. I did a ton of reference working on the production design for this. I don't have time to go through all of it, but basically looking from anything from interiors to exteriors, looking at materials and the kinds of technology and facilities these people would have, which was unexpected and totally unplanned for. And then a bunch of writing happened, where I sat down and basically laid out my plans for what each space would be communicating and why, and what kinds of resources I would need, what kinds of assets I would need to be building for it. Not unexpected, but a crazy amount of work regardless. So, what did I end up doing? Soren's area on the Isaac consists of a center room, a bed area, a cabinet, a desk, a working table, an observation deck, and after I review all of these in a non-scripted fashion, I'll go through the state of where things ended up. So, there's two views here of the cargo area. The story behind this, the thinking behind this, is that somebody was born into a spaceship that wasn't meant to accommodate them, and found a storeroom that as it emptied out over time and this person became mature enough to need a space to live, they started to retrofit one of these storage spaces. What you see in a lot of this space is these sort of modular storage crates. I designed these with the thinking that it would make sense that a crew like this would create modular systems for storing things of all sizes, but handy-dandily, they can also be rearranged into various shapes since they're made out of modular pieces. So we have somebody that's constructing furniture out of bits of cargo crate. The straps on the walls are sort of like an omni-magnetic latching system, so all the walls here would support anything you need to attach to them. There's no fixtures or anything, it's all sort of place as you go. I figured for a ship like this, probably the wall materials would be some kind of memory type sponge or something, so if a ship gets punctured, it could fall back into shape, something along those lines. Whether that technology holds up over 30 years of space flight, I'm not sure. So looking at the bed scene, we have a couple of important things that this is communicating. We have a sort of a bedroll and some improvised bedding going on, which would imply sort of a short-term stay or unexpected sort of stay. At the same time, we have somebody that's set up a little comfort drinking stuff. He's got an alarm clock. He's even got some kind of communication device that he can plug in. He's got some stuff stashed in the corner here, some extra supplies under the bed. It's meant to communicate that sort of improvised living that somebody has tried to make as comfortable as possible. So the cabinet is where I go into cliche town and said, you know, you want to talk about what someone does on a daily basis in a fictional setting? Write it on a whiteboard. I'm just short of hiding notes in various corners for you to find where people elaborate on their daily comings and goings. But there's some other cool details in this scene that I really ended up liking quite a lot. You can't really see it, unfortunately, due to the wall, but there are filtration systems in the corners of these rooms that can be plugged into these handheld cases that actually recycle perspiration and breathing water that comes out of your breath and can refill flasks of them. So they're recycling all the moisture in the environment, and it's made to basically modularly plugged in wherever one of these junction points is. And there's some dried up foods and some clothing and some packets and things like that. Moving on to the desk, it's very sparse, and it was meant to sort of imply the state of technology in the setting. This central monitor is meant to feel like something that could be picked up and folded down and moved to another location. It seems to be self-powered. It's not really plugged into anything. The keyboards and sort of the hand input device are very streamlined and simple. With regards to interactivity, I had plans during the project to actually make this screen interactive so that you could find a password somewhere and log in and like read through people's emails and whatever, and I never got around to doing that, but I kind of like the simplicity of it. So then we have a workbench, which is where some of the technology from the scene comes back again. We have sort of a modular 3D printing system with various containers and bits strewn around and rolling out on the floor. And someone's been sitting here with tools and making little sculptures and sort of printing odd shapes and things. So connected to this area is a hallway, which eventually leads to an observatory deck where you can actually get some natural starlight and peer out. And here we have a telescope set up with some chairs. We have some research materials. There's various cases strewn about that have these kind of memory sticks in them that are also plugged into the computer right where the wall shadow is in the way. So this is a bit of a reclusive spot. It's a fallback point. It's very relaxed. There's just pillows and bits strewn about. But there's also a bit of a sense of urgency here. We see some things strewn around as if they were moved suddenly. This is kind of getting close to a bit of that breadcrumbing I was discussing earlier, where you're trying to set up a little bit of cause and effect between these shots to move people from point A to point B. So, what is the state of it? I got a friend to help me out with some audio for this as well, so what I would like to do is just play a quick walkthrough of the environment. Okay, let's find it this way then. Oh, come on. So you don't use PowerPoint enough. Seriously struggling. Where's the start from current slide button? Anybody? Oh, thank you. So, where do we end up? I feel like what I ended up producing was kind of a very powerful baseline. The people that I showed it to seemed to appreciate kind of the impression, and they were able to kind of like get engaged with what was going on around them. Everything in the environment has these sort of hints of functionality and an affordance about them, but they don't have any proper material or age work going. In some respect, I feel like that's positive because it makes the scene come off as very minimalistic and serene, and at the same time it doesn't communicate quite like the state of decay going on and these other sort of setting details I would have liked to have included. There's a lack of like other small props as well. Somewhere along development I had these grand ideas of like, oh well, we'll have this observation room and we'll have it like filled with statues and little things that this guy has just been going down this rabbit hole of sitting behind his 3D printer all day. And you might be asking, where is this connective tissue and where are all the breadcrumbs that I was talking about? Well, speaking of overscope, I did have plans. I've actually scripted out all the breadcrumbs I wanted to include. The ones that made it in were the more subtle ones, like the one in the observation area that I showed you. The general sort of script I had in my head was that somebody was yanked out of bed in a rush, made his way through the environment, had to go fix something outside, maybe tried to grab his suit and got injured in the process, made his way back through the environment and would have disturbed things or maybe sat at a desk and tried to send out an emergency call or something, and then kind of like let the player be led along following the person as they fled the environment. Also, the audio is by a friend of mine named Sjoerd Limburger, who's a really awesome composer. I've worked with him many times, and if you want to know more about him, feel free to look him up or ask me. I'd be happy to put you in touch. I think that that's it for me. I'm done. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? Cool. You have a microphone, right? Here. Assuming people want to ask questions. He has a question.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I have 3 questions, if you don't mind. So
sure.
First is, what was the timeline? How much time did it take you so far?
So it was a specialization project in college. I had about half a year to do it, and it was the entire research, documentation, production, like everything basically in that time span.
So you did all the props by yourself?
Yeah, everything.
Besides? Okay, and the last question is, you mentioned that you can provide some reference materials reading. How can you provide?
Come talk to me, I'll email them to you, or I'll send you, actually you can find you can find the paper for this that I wrote. It's not a particularly great paper, but you can find it on my website, which is www.byrabbit.design. It actually has all the references in it as well, so you can find them that way as well. Cool. In the back, I think. Sorry, was that all your questions? Because you said 3, right? Okay.
Hi. It's maybe a little bit off topic, but why do you actually choose to use Unreal Engine?
I think I wanted to experiment with like the lighting and stuff, and I wanted to get into blueprinting more at the time. I didn't end up doing a whole lot of it, but I got enough into it to like script the audio triggers and the doors opening and like working in the walking speed and having a walking sound play and all this stuff. It was another dimension of me taking on too much at once, but basically because I liked the way the engine looked and I wanted to play around in it.
Right. Okay. Oh, fair enough. Thank you.
Yep. Anyone else? I've got time.
So what of this do you use in your work as a designer at Guerrilla? Do you just write the scripts, or do you design everything?
So I actually can't comment on anything I do at Guerrilla. I'm sorry. No, this is really just based off of my own process when I'm doing solo stuff. when you go into like huge AAA teams, everything, you just adjust to the way they've always done it, basically. But I would say that certainly the lessons I learned from here come in handy when it's time to sit down and figure out how to actually tackle a problem and break it down into steps. But I can't go into any more detail than that, because I'm like, I literally called my HR guy yesterday, hey, I need to do a talk, is that cool or whatever? He's like, don't say anything. So that's the situation I'm in. All right, anyone else? Cool, I think that's